It's Monday, the 24th of March. Welcome to the President's Daily Brief. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. Coming to you yet again from an airport lounge somewhere. I'm not sure where it is at this point. I can't keep track. All right, let's get briefed. We'll start off with a major report out of Germany. China is reportedly considering sending troops to Ukraine as part of a future peacekeeping force. That's right, Chinese troops in Ukraine. I'll explain why that's such a big deal and why the consequences could reach far beyond Ukraine's borders. Later in the show, a major escalation in the Middle East as Israel launches airstrikes into Lebanon following a rocket barrage coming from Lebanese territory. Plus, as the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, continue their renewed efforts in Gaza, Hamas faces calls from Palestinians to relinquish their power in order to avoid, quote, the end of the Palestinians' existence. And in today's back of the brief, it looks like a win for the Trump administration's immigration agenda. Venezuela says that it will once again accept deportation flights from the U.S., reversing a recent suspension. But first, today's PDB Spotlight. We'll start things off today with a surprising development, that's putting it mildly, related to Putin's war in Ukraine. According to a new report from the German newspaper Die Welt, China is considering sending troops to Ukraine. Now, China's PLA, the People's Liberation Army, wouldn't deploy to Ukraine to fight, but to function as part of a future peacekeeping force. Makes you wonder how the North Korean troops that are fighting next to Russian soldiers would feel about that. According to the report, China is angling to join what British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is calling a, quote, coalition of the willing. Now, that's the group of countries prepared to send troops to Ukraine to enforce a ceasefire between Kyiv and Moscow, if and when that day comes. An unnamed European Union diplomatic source told Die Welt that the situation is, quote, delicate, well, that's probably, again, putting it mildly, but that China's inclusion in a peacekeeping mission could help get Russia to agree to such a force. The thinking here is fairly simple. Moscow would never accept NATO troops in Ukraine, they've said as much repeatedly, not even under a UN peacekeeping mandate. But Chinese troops, well, that's different, given that China's Xi Jinping has basically propped up the Russian economy for the past 3 years and enabled Putin to keep his war machine chugging away. Now, if China has actually floated this idea as a possibility, it is highly likely that Chinese and Russian high-level officials have discussed the idea. And if they've discussed the idea and consider it an actual possibility, well, it would be because Putin and Xi view it as advantageous to their own interests. Up to this point, the biggest roadblock to any international peacekeeping force has always been Russia's total distrust of NATO. Well, not to mention Putin's lack of interest in stopping his war on Ukraine. There is that. But were he inclined to agree to some legitimate type of ceasefire, there's zero chance that Moscow would allow NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. But China, despite some complicated history, is viewed by the Kremlin as a strategic partner and, as mentioned, an economic lifeline. If a peacekeeping force were needed to monitor or enforce a ceasefire, China might be the only major power that Russia wouldn't immediately reject. And that gives Beijing a very rare position, a kind of diplomatic leverage that no Western nation could claim. It could even let China present itself as a so-called, quote, honest broker, capable of holding both sides to account. And yes, I somehow managed to say that with a straight face. Now, to be clear, as mentioned, China has supported Russia throughout this war. They've parroted Russian talking points, ramped up trade, and sent dual-use goods that help Moscow on the battlefield. So the idea of China as a neutral party is humorous at best. Something else worth mentioning, which makes this potential scenario remarkable and concerning. If China does send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, it would mark the first time ever that the Chinese military establishes any kind of presence in Europe. The People's Liberation Army has participated in peacekeeping missions in Africa and Asia, but never in a conflict zone in the West. That would be, in geopolitical terms, a huge milestone. It would signal a major evolution in how China sees its military role around the world, moving beyond regional power projection in the South China Sea or Indian Ocean and stepping onto the global stage in a much more assertive way. It would also allow China to test and refine its overseas operations, everything from logistics and chain of command to how it gathers intel and coordinates with foreign forces. And for Europe, the arrival of Chinese troops, even in a peacekeeping capacity, would raise all sorts of new questions. New diplomatic frameworks, new coordination protocols, new military rules of engagement, the list frankly goes on. It could even set a precedent. Once Chinese troops are on the ground in one European conflict zone, well, it becomes theoretically a lot easier to imagine them showing up in others, maybe in the Middle East or Central Asia. Symbolically, it's a Cold War reversal. China, the once isolated communist giant, stepping in to fill a role that NATO either can't or won't fill. To be fair, we're still a long way from any kind of ceasefire or peacekeeping agreement, or the deployment of a peacekeeping force. But discussions are underway. President Zelensky and other European leaders are expected to meet in Paris this coming Thursday to talk through a possible peace plan and long-term security guarantees. If China really is serious about joining a mission in Ukraine, well, that subject may well be on the table during the Paris discussions. All right, coming up next, a major escalation in the Middle East as Israel strikes Lebanon and ramps up operations in Gaza, while Hamas faces mounting pressure from Palestinians and Fatah leadership to step aside. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here. Tariff wars, recession fears, stubborn inflation. Well, no wonder gold has been routinely hitting all-time highs, right? In volatile markets, including the current one, look, the important thing is don't sit on the sidelines with your head in the sand. Take control and safeguard your savings. It's uncertainty and also the desire to diversify savings that is leading so many Americans today to turn to Birch Gold Group. They've helped tens of thousands convert an existing IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. And it's worth asking, is it time for you to hedge against inflation and economic instability with gold? To learn how to own physical gold in a tax-sheltered account, it's simple. Text PDB, as in President's Daily Brief, that's PDB to 989898. Birch Gold will send you a free, no-obligation information kit. Again, text PDB to the number 989898. Look, with an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and countless 5-star reviews, I trust Birch Gold to help me protect my savings with gold. And you can too. It's easy. Just text PDB to 989898 today. Welcome back to the PDB. In a significant return to fighting, Israel launched 2 waves of airstrikes on southern Lebanon Saturday, killing at least 7 in retaliation for a rocket barrage from the territory. The strikes mark the most serious flare-up with Hezbollah since last year's U.S.-brokered ceasefire began to fray. According to the Israeli Defense Forces, the strikes targeted dozens of Hezbollah positions, including weapons depots, command hubs, launch pads, and infrastructure nodes, most notably in the coastal city of Tyre, one of southern Lebanon's major urban centers. But Hezbollah denied launching the rockets that prompted the IDF response, accusing Israel of fabricating a pretext to resume military operations. While the terror group typically avoids comment on such incidents, its uncharacteristic denial this time signals growing unease amid mounting pressure, both at home and abroad. The first wave of Israeli strikes took place in the early morning, followed by a second barrage later that night, reportedly greenlit by Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz. In a joint statement, the two insisted the action was necessary to safeguard border communities from the Iran-backed terror group. Meanwhile, Lebanon's military said it dismantled 3 rudimentary Hezbollah rocket launchers and opened an investigation into the origins of the attack. Lebanese officials wasted no time, as you might imagine, in condemning the Israeli strikes. The country's prime minister warned that the country was being pulled toward, quote, a new war, while President Joseph Aoun decried what he called, quote, attempts to drag Lebanon into a cycle of violence. The United Nations interim force in Lebanon echoed those concerns, urging all sides to recommit to what remains of the fragile ceasefire. That truce, crafted by American and French negotiators back in November, had until the weekend managed to dial down a conflict that had been, of course, simmering and brewing for over a year. Under its terms, Hezbollah agreed to pull fighters and weapons back from the border, while the Lebanese armed forces were to boost deployments in the area. In exchange, Israel was to begin withdrawing from newly occupied outposts by January. But Israel extended that deadline, pushing the withdrawal date to 18 February. It still maintains controls over 5 positions in southern Lebanon, citing the Lebanese army's failure to adequately secure the area. In the meantime, Israeli airstrikes have continued, with Jerusalem insisting that they're aimed at preventing Hezbollah from rebuilding its arsenal. Now, Hezbollah's campaign began in the wake of Hamas's 7 October terror attacks on Israel. The terror group framed its attacks as an act of solidarity with Hamas and the people of Gaza. Since then, the border clashes have spiraled into the deadliest regional spillover of the Gaza war to date. Dozens of Hezbollah commanders, much like Hamas, have been killed, large numbers of fighters lost, and a significant portion of its weapons stockpile wiped out. For its part, Lebanon's military has struggled to reassert control in the south, where Hezbollah remains deeply entrenched, and frankly, that's been the history of Lebanon's military. President Aoun has repeatedly insisted that only the state should bear arms. That's a not-so-subtle jab at Hezbollah, but enforcing that remains a politically fraught, if not logistically impossible, task. At least until Israel's campaign to degrade Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed proxy was actually more of a fighting force than the Lebanese military. Okay, staying in the region, Israel confirmed it killed Hamas political leader Salah al-Bardawil in a Saturday night airstrike in southern Gaza, marking the 3rd high-ranking Hamas official to be assassinated in the span of a week. Bardawil, a longtime figure in Hamas's political bureau and head of its planning and development ministry, was killed alongside his wife in a drone strike that targeted a tent shelter in Khan Yunis. Israeli officials accused Bardawil of playing a central role in the terror group's strategic wing, claiming that his elimination would deal a significant blow to Hamas's ability to govern and its operational capacity. Reports from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry say at least 19 people, including Bardawil, were killed in strikes overnight, though those numbers could not be independently verified and did not distinguish between civilians and terrorists. The strike comes on the heels of Israel's assassinations of 2 other top Hamas figures last week, its internal security chief and the terror group's de facto government head, Issam Da'alis. Together, the killings form part of an intensifying Israeli campaign to dismantle Hamas's leadership structure. As we've been discussing on the PDB, ground operations have also ramped up across the Strip. In the north, Israeli forces resumed combat in Beit Hanun, an area previously cleared but now re-entered, as the IDF says it's targeting remaining Hamas infrastructure and expanding a strategic buffer zone along the border. Fighter jets carried out strikes ahead of a ground advance, which military officials described as a renewed phase of combat. In southern Gaza, Israeli forces encircled Tel Sultan, a neighborhood in Rafah, long regarded as a Hamas stronghold. The IDF said troops are now conducting raids on tunnel networks and command centers that are believed to have housed hostages. Residents in Tel Sultan were issued a, quote, urgent evacuation order, with an IDF Arabic language spokesman warning the area had become an active combat zone. Maps of the evacuation corridor circulated online, urging civilians to flee westward toward the coast on foot. Meanwhile, in a rare break from internal silence, the Palestinian Authority's ruling Fatah faction called on Hamas to relinquish its hold on Gaza. In a statement sent to AFP, a Fatah spokesman warned that continued fighting under Hamas rule would, quote, lead to the end of Palestinians' existence. On Friday, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said he ordered the IDF to seize more territory unless Hamas agrees to release the remaining hostages. Katz stated, quote, "As long as Hamas continues its refusal, it will lose more and more land that will be added to Israel," end quote. Though Israel has largely refrained from annexing areas that it's captured, Katz suggested the IDF might maintain a long-term presence in captured areas to safeguard troops and nearby communities. As we noted last week on the PDB, Prime Minister Netanyahu authorized a full resumption of hostilities after Hamas rejected a proposal to extend Phase 1 of the ceasefire. The message from Jerusalem: negotiations, if they occur at all, will now proceed under fire. All right, coming up in the back of the brief, a win for the Trump administration as Venezuela reverses its suspension of deportation flights from the U.S. We'll have those details next. This podcast is brought to you in part by Stash. Saving and investing can feel impossible, but with Stash, well, it's not just possible, it's easy. Stash isn't just an investing app. It's a registered investment advisor that combines automated investing with dependable financial strategies to help you reach your goals faster. They'll provide you with personalized advice on what to invest in based on your goals. Or if you want to just sit back and watch your money go to work, you can do that. Just opt into their award-winning, expert-managed portfolio that picks stocks for you. Stash has helped millions of Americans reach their financial goals and starts at just $3 per month. Look, don't let your savings sit around. Make your money work harder for you. Go to get.stash.com/PDB to see how you can receive $25 towards your first stock purchase and to view important disclosures. That's get.stash.com/PDB. This is a paid non-client endorsement, not representative of all clients and not a guarantee. Investment advisory services offered by Stash Investments, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Investing, of course, involves risk, and as they say, offer is subject to terms and conditions. In today's back of the brief, Venezuela has agreed to resume accepting deportation flights for its migrants after halting cooperation earlier this month, marking a major win for the Trump administration's deportation policy. The pivot came Saturday when Venezuelan strongman Nicolas Maduro's regime reached an agreement with Washington to resume deportation flights for Venezuelan nationals who crossed into the U.S. illegally. The first flight touched down Sunday, effectively ending a suspension triggered after the administration reversed a Biden-era easing of sanctions on Venezuelan oil exports. Jorge Rodriguez, president of Venezuela's National Assembly and Maduro's lead negotiator with Washington, confirmed the policy shift, stating, quote, "Migrating is not a crime," but his remarks were laced with defiance. Rodriguez vowed to rescue, quote, "our brothers kidnapped in El Salvador." That's a nod to Venezuelan deportees held in that country's prison from U.S. deportation flights earlier this month, despite their affiliations with gangs like Tren de Aragua, the TDA, and MS-13. Maduro himself echoed the message, calling the migrants, quote, "kidnapped," framing the deportations not as a law enforcement effort, but as an affront to national dignity. That framing, however, hasn't slowed the Trump administration's momentum. Speaking of an affront to national dignity, how about Maduro's well-documented theft of his country's last presidential election? Or his violent crackdowns on any dissent? Or maybe his arrests of political opponents and opposition activists? Maduro, basically, is giving a masterclass in affronting national dignity. Regardless, since the collapse of the initial agreement, Washington has now redoubled pressure on Latin American governments to align with U.S. immigration enforcement priorities. Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned that Caracas would face, quote, "severe and escalating sanctions if it refused to take its citizens back." That threat now appears to have paid off. As we've been tracking on the PDB, roughly 350 Venezuelans have been deported in recent weeks, including around 180 who had been held at Guantanamo Bay. The breakthrough with Caracas arrives amid legal headwinds for the administration. The White House has relied heavily on the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That's a dusty wartime statute that grants the president sweeping authority to expel nationals from hostile states. That provision had been used to justify deporting Venezuelans to third-party nations like El Salvador. But a federal judge in Washington earlier this month issued a temporary injunction, ruling that the administration's application of the law exceeds its statutory scope. The new deal with Venezuela offers a cleaner legal pathway, one less vulnerable to U.S. court challenges. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Monday, the 24th of March. Of course, to listen to the show ad-free, well, simply become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. Very simple. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.